Welcome to Module 5, friends. We are now segueing from the student development and the learning theories modules, that foundation that we built in modules 2 through 4. And we're now segueing into, now that we know and understand these things about how students learn, about how they grow and develop, how can we shape classroom experiences in such a way to support that growth and development and learning? And so we call this concept of supporting students this way effective classroom leadership. And that's what we want for all of our teachers, for all educators in the field to become effective classroom leaders. And in order to do this, we have to build our tool belt. We've got to arm ourselves, so to speak, with some useful research-based approaches to ensuring that we are creating the best environment for students to learn and grow. There are 5 critical components of effective classroom leadership, and each module you're going to learn about a different one, a new one. So our first one that we're going to jump into is critical component 1, clear expectations. So this module focuses on establishing and maintaining clear, consistent expectations. These are essential for building a safe, productive environment where students know what's expected and can thrive academically and socially. As we explore strategies in this module, keep your note catcher nearby. You'll be tracking key ideas and examples to use in your own teaching. Pay attention to how student-centered language, modeling, and routines can set a strong foundation from day one. So you'll keep track of your notes with the note catcher that's provided on Canvas. You're going to turn that in. I believe it's module 10. It's in a later module. You can check the course calendar to be sure. But you want to do that for every module. For the critical components has a corresponding note catcher that allows you to dig deep into your understanding, to make sense of what you're learning, and to also apply it in different ways. So by the end of this module, you're going to identify strategies for establishing and communicating classroom norms, recognize student-centered language that promotes accountability, analyze practical examples from various grade levels, and then reflect and apply learning using your note catcher, as we mentioned before. Students thrive when they understand boundaries and expectations. It's not about being strict. It's about being clear, consistent, and supportive. Strong classroom expectations help prevent disruptions, promote positive behavior, and give students a sense of stability. It's essential to start the year with clear guidelines, but they shouldn't just come from you. Involve students when possible and speak in ways that highlight what they can do, not just what they can't. Reinforcement isn't a one-time event. It must be consistent, visible, and positive. So some key takeaways from communicating expectations effectively are to set those norms at the start, to regularly revisit them, reinforce them, hold students accountable for them, and then use student-centered language. Involve them in this process of communication. Also, make sure that when possible, you want to frame everything in a way that's positive. Student-centered language can be tricky, especially it's something that we want to think about in advance. It's definitely not something we want to develop in the heat of the moment. And so how we frame expectations matters. Notice the shift from negative to positive in these examples. Student-centered language is about helping students internalize expectations in a way that builds ownership. It's supportive, encouraging, and affirms what's possible. It emphasizes opportunities for students to grow. So example 1, don't talk during lessons. Well, that's one way that we could frame things. But if we say, raise your hand to speak, what we're doing is we're framing it in such a way that we want to ensure that we're allowing students to have voice their questions or contribute with their comments. However, when we say raise your hand, what we're doing is we're giving them the acceptable form of behavior that's attached, that's required for them to contribute in that way. So we're saying, yes, we want you involved. We want you to speak. This is how you do it. Example number 2, don't be late. Or we could frame it more positively, be on time and ready to learn. And so what we're doing is we're emphasizing the types of behaviors that it takes in order for students to learn effectively. Being on time, being present, having materials. So the way that we frame things needs to be student-centered and affirmative. Here are some elementary examples of clearly setting those expectations in student-friendly language. Structure and routine are everything in elementary settings. And to be honest with you, all students really thrive when we have structure and routine. Morning meetings build consistency and community. Morning meetings help set the tone for the day, and they can also be a time to revisit some expectations that perhaps are not clear, have not been clearly set for students, or simply need to be reinforced. Letting students help create rules increases buy-in. So many times when students create rules, they'll say things like, be kind, be safe, especially at the elementary grade level. We could use, as we talked about with some of the previous modules, dig deep for what does that mean? What does it mean to be kind? What does it look like? Give me some examples, and students will then give examples. You could actually even make an entire anchor chart, of what that looks like. Some visual displays act as daily reminders, and they give students cues for what to expect and how to behave. So schedule posters, some of the expectations, as I mentioned before, allowing students to be involved in an anchor chart of maybe how do we move through the halls? When we say keep, don't be distracting, what does that mean? What are some things that we could do to be distracting? And then what are some behaviors that we should do to prevent ourselves, and create an anchor chart, or a flow chart on the board for that. So those are some elementary examples. As you visit those elementary field placements, see what kind of things you can find, those visual displays, those instructions from the teacher, and even how some students become involved in setting those expectations and reinforcing them. So let's look at the middle school examples now. Middle schoolers need structure and voice, and you're going to see this. This group is typically more talkative. It takes a little bit more intentionality and repeated reinforcements for this grade level. So help them internalize expectations by phrasing rules in positive and giving them visual supports. So again, it's the same thing as you're going to see with the elementary. Routines reduce downtime and it keeps them focused. So inviting students into the process of creating expectations builds mutual respect. So focus on what to do. This is what we talk about, positive rules. What should they do when they enter the class? Maybe have like a checklist of, this is what you do when you enter class. Visual reminders, procedures, and steps. That's very helpful. You're going to notice that visual reminders are good for all students. There are especially students who perhaps are English as a second language, or maybe even those who have reading disabilities. But honestly, visual reminders are great for all students. Structured routines are important because it helps with transitions, especially since students really begin changing classes at the middle school level. Sometimes late elementary, but definitely by middle school, they're typically changing classes. And sometimes it takes a little bit more to get them back on track, so to speak, when they enter the classroom. Having those transitional procedures in place and holding students accountable is important. Collaborative rulemaking increases investment in um, definitely holding students accountable for behavior, but also in the academic portion of the lesson. So, for example, sometimes students might be struggling to understand a concept, not necessarily because of the way that it's being presented, but there might be other things going on in the classroom that are distracting. And so, setting those expectations for what it looks like to learn at each stage of the lesson can be really important. Sometimes modeling it for the students, even at the middle school level, is really important. It can help reinforce those concepts. Now let's look at high school. High school students respond to autonomy and respect. And so this is the part where, they're really beginning to become adults. Begin with collaborative norms. They'll take ownership when they feel heard. Use your syllabus to clearly communicate academic and behavioral expectations. Finally, regular check-ins show that their voice matters and help keep the classroom climate responsive and respectful. It is very common in high school classrooms to do periodic check-ins. What's working, what's not working. So this is what we had in place for, when we enter class, these are the procedures we're supposed to follow. But I'm noticing that we're still having some trouble, settling in. What needs to be changed? What's not working? And, those sorts of conversations are things that high school students can participate in. And believe it or not, they actually can help reinforce the norms that maybe some of their peers are struggling with. Um, Detailed expectations and reviewing it regularly with them for grading, for conduct are very important as well. So again, clarity, clarity, clarity. One of my favorite quotes is clarity is kindness. It's from Brene Brown. She is a wonderful researcher in the field, particularly of leadership, but just human behavior. And I feel that this is true for the elementary, middle, and high school. Clarity is kindness. So be very clear to your students about what the expectations are. Setting expectations is only half the work, though. Reinforcing them consistently through visual tools, teacher modeling, and acknowledgement of success keeps them alive in your classroom. When students meet expectations, recognize it. Positive reinforcement builds confidence and motivates continued success. As you begin to observe, take note of how teachers and students are reinforcing expectations in the classroom. By the time you visit these classrooms, they're going to be up and running. So most of what you're going to see is reinforcement, but take note of that. Take note of when they're recognized for a positive behavior. Also take note of maybe some missed opportunities, sometimes when the teacher could have acknowledged some of those positive behaviors and perhaps he or she was too busy or distracted. What impact did that have? What impact could it have had? So just make notice of those things as you begin to observe. Take a moment to reflect on this module's learning. Which of these strategies do you see yourself using when you begin to establish expectations? How could you adapt them to your future classroom? Use your note catcher to jot down reflections and examples. These will be useful when you begin lesson planning or observing in your field placements, and it will also be very useful as you prepare to gather those notes and collect those notes for the field and eventually for your final exam. So I'll see you next module. I hope you are having a great week.